In part 1 of The Miracle of Israel, The Saved Remnant, we saw the shock of the American and Allied forces discovering the horrors of the Nazi death camps, the problems and challenges facing the survivors after liberation, and their search for family and loved ones who may have survived. We saw the stark reality of anti-Semitism after the war, the displaced persons camps, and the indifference of the world to the survivors' plight. We saw their crisis of faith and the remarkable personal stories of faith after the Holocaust. We saw the untold story of Sephardic Jewry during the war. The efforts of Bricha, the escape movement that smuggled survivors from Europe to Palestine, and the unfolding drama of the British naval blockade that tried to stop them. We saw the armed resistance of the Jewish freedom fighters against the British. And we saw the dramatic story of the Exodus and the 4,500 survivors on it who were shipped back to the Death Land, Germany. Now, to Faith and Fates, the Miracle of Israel, the struggle for the state, and how it came into existence.
With world opinion swinging in favor of the refugees in Europe and the establishment of a Jewish state, the Zionists in Palestine and in the DP camps still needed the help and influence of world Jewry to support their cause, especially in America.
In America, although not everyone is caught up equally in the excitement of the move towards establishment of the State of Israel, the membership figures in the Zionist Organization of America double, triple in the period from, let's say, 1945, 1948. People are very involved in supporting the State of Israel. There's a lot of excitement, and they get involved by contributing money, by going to rallies at places like Madison Square Garden, or going to street demonstrations, or petitioning their elected officials, doing what can be done within the confines of the American democracy.
In Palestine, bombings, ambushes, killings and retaliatory murders were daily events. The British faced increasing pressure from both Jewish and Arab insurgents, as well as the growing problem of the Jewish refugees, and President Truman openly seeking a humanitarian solution. In frustration, and with the inability to solve the problems, Foreign Minister Ernest Bevin decided to extricate Britain from Palestine and refer its fate to the United Nations. Though David Ben-Gurion and the leaders of the Jewish Agency had condemned and disassociated themselves from the violent methodology of the Irgun and the Lehi, the military blows struck against the British forces in Palestine undoubtedly contributed to the British decision.
They could not cope with the question of illegal immigration, and the struggle in the country became worse from day to day, and the British appeared more and more like oppressors. Now, public opinion in the world would not accept it. At a certain point, the British felt they don't know what to do, and they decided to quit. They felt that they were the punching bag of both the Jews and the Arabs, because both sides would not agree to anything that was acceptable to the other.
The British government had won a Pyrrhic victory in World War II. It emerged as a nominal victor, but its empire had been severely weakened, among other places in the Middle East. The British were beginning to draw down their empire. In the middle and late 1940s, they were going to withdraw from India, from Palestine, from other parts of the Middle East. The Soviet Union welcomed this and regarded Palestine as perhaps one of the first big cracks in the British wall of imperialism.
Britain, having exhausted its resources and energy fighting the war, now stepped back, and America stepped forward to lead the Western Allies. Having learnt the lessons of World War I, the Allies now began to focus their efforts on rebuilding Europe, especially Germany.
There's a recognition that the mistakes of World War I, of abandonment of the international scene, is something that America cannot afford to do. And we as an American people, as an American government, as an American nation, emerged from World War II as one of the two great world powers, along with our antagonists, the Soviet Union. So abandonment of the battlefield, this is the political battlefield, is something that cannot take place. And one of the ingenious plans that is promulgated by the American government is the Marshall Plan to get Western Europe and Central Europe, Germany and Austria and the countries they decimated, back on their feet so that they will not become victims of the incursions of the Soviet Union, which had desires to move even further westward, as the Soviets reassert the communist idea of being an international movement.
The end of the war saw the Soviet Union as the great victor on the continent, because the dividing line between American and British and French forces on the one hand, and the Soviets on the other hand, left actually in the Soviet military control all of Eastern Europe. And the result was that now the British felt threatened. The British needed American support against the Russians all over Europe, because otherwise the Russians would have proven an enemy that Britain cannot face. It was not by chance that Churchill declared at that time that an Iron Curtain descended all over Europe.
The Iron Curtain was the symbol of what was to become the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the free world. Soviet expansionism was becoming a dominating threat, not only in Europe, Britain, and America, but also in the Middle East.
Stalin begins to revert in 1945, certainly when the war is over, to the traditional Soviet posture of anti-Western policies. He understands the victory of the war as the defeat of fascism. And what is fascism? Fascism is the last stage of capitalism. It means now that the rest of the capitalist world is doomed. And the proof is that Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Bulgaria, and the eastern part of Germany have all become socialist. The wave of the future is socialism.
To consolidate his power in Eastern Europe, Stalin closed the doors on Soviet immigration. The effect of this was that now several million Jews were trapped behind the Soviet Iron Curtain with no hope of escape. Ironically, the Soviet Union would play a very different role in deciding the issue of a Jewish homeland in Palestine in the United Nations. In April 1947, having been given the Palestine problem to solve, the United Nations formed UNSCOP, the 11-member United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, to investigate the situation. It was now up to this committee to determine the possibility of a Jewish state in Palestine.
I traveled everywhere they went and found the members of that committee so wise and so wide-eyed and so open to everywhere we went that I felt this committee is going to do something real.
It was remarkable because its members consisted of small states, not of America, not of Russia, certainly not the British, etc. UNSCOP did exactly what the Anglo-American Commission did. It sent its delegates first to the DP camps. It heard testimony in Washington and in London, then went off to Eretz Yisrael. They were boycotted by the Arabs as they were earlier, and so they basically got to see the Zionist side. But they also saw the viability of the Jewish enterprise in Eretz Yisrael. Not only agriculture, industry, culture, that they could defend themselves. So UNSCOP, on the 1st of September 1947, announced its recommendation, majority and minority. Majority would clearly be a separate Jewish and a separate Arab state in Palestine. The minority to favor clearly the Arab side. That day to me is again the hand of God in history. I don't want to be over dramatic, but let's remember that Herzl, where the whole story politically began for Zionism, writes in his diaries after the First World Zionist Congress, on the 1st of September 1897, if I say that in 2, 3, 5 years a Jewish state will be created, everybody would laugh at me. This is secreted in his diaries. But in 50 years it will happen. Exactly 50 years to that date, UNSCOP's majority report came out for a Jewish state.
With another dramatic swing of history's pendulum, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, the reality of a Jewish homeland seemed possible. But with 56 members of the United Nations yet having to vote on the partition plan, the outcome was far from certain.
To add to this uncertainty, even with a desperate need to solve the refugee problem, there were issues regarding the establishment of a Jewish state that divided the Jewish world.
There are significant pockets of non-Zionist and anti-Zionist feeling within the United States. Some of them were involved in the Reform movement, which in the 19th and early 20th century was doctrinally anti-Zionist, anti-nationalist. Also, part of the story is that the Orthodox theological problem with the State of Israel is based upon two fundamental principles. One, the idea that Jews were exiled by God and they are to remain in diaspora, in Goral, until in a messianic context, God will redeem the Jewish people. And anyone who attempts to hasten that return is running counter to the thrust of Jewish tradition. And if you say that what's going on now, namely the Zionist movement, is the beginning of the foretold redemption, the people who are running this redemption aren't exactly the most appropriate Jewish role models. So there's a basic theological problem, and it's a question with the secular nature of Zionism. By the time we get to 1948, Zionism has swept the field in terms of American Jewry. From Reform to Orthodox, there's a general positive sense that this is a very important moment for the Jewish people and for Jewish history.
Sephardic Jews are often accused of not having been Zionists. Political Zionism as a European socialist movement was not part of their world, but closeness to the land of Israel was. The return of the Jews from the Muslim world to Israel had begun 100 years before. Jews of Bukhara of Central Asia were among the first to come and settle outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem. The Jews of Bukhara did not have to have a Zionist emissary tell them, come, become a new Jew. They were already coming to Eretz Israel. The Jews of Yemen had come 100 years before. The excitement of return, the sense of redemption that filled the hearts of the Sephardic Jews throughout the Mediterranean world occurred. It wasn't a political solution of rational problems. It was a fulfillment of a Jewish dream.
The race for Palestine was on, and the diplomatic maneuvering by both the Arabs and the Jews to lobby the member nations of the UN for their vote became a country-by-country struggle by the Zionists to ensure support for their dream of creating a Jewish state and returning to the homeland of the Jewish people.
So there are various factors involved. A lot of it is luck. Some of it is humanitarian support. But every string was pulled by the Jews. It was a nip-and-tuck thing. There was no certainty of a two-thirds majority.
The UN's partition plan for Palestine gave the Jews a disjointed, sometimes disconnected, gerrymandered country. It also separated Jerusalem from the rest of the Jewish state and placed it under UN international supervision. The response by both Jews and Arabs to this United Nations plan would eerily foreshadow all future Arab-Israeli peace negotiations held much later in the century, when the Arabs again would fail to agree to peace treaties that clearly favored them.
Although the UN's proposition was far from ideal for the Jews, the Zionists quickly agreed to the UN plan of two states, one Jewish, one Arab. However, the Arabs not only rejected the plan in its entirety, they warned that they would push the Jews into the sea. On November 29, 1947, the resolution to partition Palestine and establish a Jewish state was put to the vote.
Afghanistan? No. Argentina? Abstention? Saudi Arabia? No. Soviet Union? Yes. United Kingdom? Abstain. The United States? Yes.
The resolution of the DAC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Amazingly, the world powers had finally declared a Jewish state in Palestine to be legitimate. A dramatic result, given that it came so closely on the heels of one of the most anti-Semitic periods in Jewish history.
And the Arabs stood up and said, "Over our dead bodies," and walked out. I was at the UN when they did that.
The Arab states, of course, voted against the establishment of these two states, with the philosophy that either we get all or nothing at all. This maximalist stance proved to be their undoing for the next 50 or more years.
One of the great surprises in the UN vote for partition was the Soviet Union's decision to support the founding of the Jewish state.
It's miraculous to a Jewish believer. It's perfectly understandable. Someone higher up is pulling the strings. But to the historian, it's the only time when the Soviets and the Americans are agreeing at the UN at the height of the Cold War on a major issue.
Why did the Soviet Union support the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine? Andrei Gromyko, the USSR representative to the UN, depicted it in humanitarian terms. And he said, the Jewish people had suffered tremendously in the last war. Millions of Jews are displaced. They have no place to go. He was not, of course, referring to Soviet Jews, but to the refugees from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and so on. They need a homeland. A Jewish state in Palestine would provide that. That was the official reason. The unofficial reason for supporting the Jewish state was that it would get the British out and begin a process whereby the British would be forced to withdraw from Jordan, from Egypt, from the Sudan, from Iraq, and so on. Moreover, of all these countries, the Jewish Yishuv, what was to become the state of Israel, had the greatest potential for becoming a socialist state. What the Soviets seem to have neglected was that the dominant socialist party in Palestine, in the Jewish Yishuv, was not a Marxist party. And when the Soviets began the anti-Semitic internal domestic campaign in 1948, most of the Yishuv, not all of it, but most of the Yishuv turned anti-Soviet.
The repercussions of the UN vote for partition would have a direct effect on the nearly 1 million Sephardic Jews living in Arab countries.
The Jews of Muslim land were sitting on a volcano. The events of Palestine, that is, the riots, the attacks on the Jews, the discussions within the United Nations of what would be the fate of Palestine, all of these incidents begin to have local reverberations in Muslim lands. Almost 1 million Jews were caught in various stages of destruction. Jewish bank accounts had been frozen in Syria, in Lebanon, the setting on fire of synagogue in Libya, pogroms in Cairo. All of these have been part of the upheaval of the Arab nationalist spark that were going on in the Near Eastern countries. If the state of Israel would succeed in emerging, they would be endangered. If the state of Israel did not succeed in emerging, they would also be endangered. So that they were waiting with bated breath, with much trepidation, with a sense that their fate hung in the balance once again.
Looking back at the partition plan, there was one vital thing left out that may have changed the course of history in the Middle East. No provision was ever made for a UN mediating force to implement the plan. The world and the British turned their backs and left the Jews and the Arabs to sort out the problem by war. Even while defending themselves from increasingly violent Arab attacks, the Jews continually attempted to offer the Arabs their hand in peace. Unfortunately for everyone, Jew and Arab alike, the Arabs would have none of it.
Directly after the UN vote, Arab anti-Jewish aggression escalated. Within the first week, 62 Jews were murdered by the Arabs. Over the next several months, throughout Palestine, in cities and settlements, Jews were attacked and killed. During February of 1948, Arab militants exploded 2 major bombs in Jerusalem. The first destroyed the Palestine Post building. And 2 weeks later, a bomb was detonated on Ben Yehuda, Jerusalem's main street, killing 44 people.
A Hadassah medical convoy with markings of the Hadassah hospital, killing 77 Jewish doctors, nurses, medical students on their way to Mount Scopus. The British were nearby and lifted nary a finger until it was too late.
By May of 1948, 1,256 Jews, mostly civilians, had been killed by the Arabs. The British not only continued to prevent Jewish immigration, but increasingly clamped down on the Jews in Palestine from importing desperately needed arms and ammunition to defend themselves.
One of their major aims was to find the caches of Jewish arms and to confiscate them. And they did indeed locate the main cache of arms in Kibbutz Yagur, and it was a great disaster.
To compound the problem, while Jews were restricted from entering Palestine, Arab infiltrators from Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Lebanon entered the country unhindered. Jerusalem was cut off by an Arab blockade, and the Jewish quarter of the Old City was besieged and bombarded.
The Arabs attacked the Jews in their most vulnerable positions, namely the roads. Almost all the roads were under Arab control because the roads were dispersed with Arab villages, and they would attack Jewish convoys going from point to point. Especially vulnerable was the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. It was one road going through a very narrow strip of land between Arab villages and the mountains, and the result was casualties, and also Jerusalem could not be supplied with food, with fuel, and it became a very crucial situation.
With the Arab control of the roads and Jerusalem under siege, many outlying Jewish settlements were isolated and vulnerable to attack. Miraculously, only 2 of them fell to the Arabs. After a fierce battle and tragic loss of life, the Etzion block of settlements in the Hebron Hills and the Kibbutz Mishmar HaYarden on the Syrian border succumbed to the attackers.
Disunity among the Arab forces in 1947-48 tremendously weakened their position, whereas the Jews had this very impressive, experienced Haganah, with Etzel and Lehi contributing their own parts to the struggle of the Jews. The Palestinian Arabs had no real cohesive force, had no united leadership, and no infrastructure to fight the Jews, and ultimately this led to their downfall.
The leadership and the educated classes in the Arab cities preferred to leave the country and not to stay in the war zone. With the departure of the leadership, the simple people felt that they had no guidance. Anarchy became the rule of the day in the Arab areas.
So much of the Arab struggles were not so much against the Jews at first, but different Arab chieftains and people come from the outside who could not get along one with another.
A power struggle erupted amongst the Arab leadership. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who had spent a major part of the war in Nazi Germany, allied with Hitler, organizing the Nazi Muslim Legion, wanted to secure his domination of Arab Palestine. In Syria, the Arab League formed the Arab Liberation Army in the fall of 1947 to counter the Mufti's ambitions. On another front, King Abdullah of Transjordan had his own ambitions to merge Palestine with his kingdom. Fawzi al-Qaugji, who had previously led the rioting against the Jews in 1936 and had also returned from living in exile in Nazi Germany, with a force of 7,000 men and the aid of the Lebanese and Syrian armies, sought to drive the Jews out of the Galilee and all of northern Palestine. Hundreds of volunteer Syrians, Iraqis, and fascist Bosnians who had served in the Nazi Muslim Legion and exiled Palestinians infiltrated Palestine and formed the nucleus of Jihad al-Muqaddas, holy fighters. Several thousand local Palestinians joined them. Also, the Muslim Brotherhood, mostly fanatic Islamic fighters from Egypt, fought in the hills of Hebron and the Negev. However, in reality, despite isolated victories, the Arabs were beginning to lose their war over the control of Palestine.
The Arab armies could not unite themselves, and therefore, when they instructed some Arabs to leave, Jaffa was controlled by 70,000 Arabs overnight. When the Haganah, for example, forces got major key posts, almost all of these Arabs fled. They didn't have to flee. The Jews in Haifa begged Abba Hushi and the others, the mayor, stay. They fled. And many assumed, as in past wars or struggles, that they would return home. That was not to be the case.
The mass of Palestinian Arabs did not understand that this war against the Jews was fundamentally different from previous colonial wars in the area. In past wars, the local Arabs fled their villages knowing they would return after the conflict ended. But this time, it was different. Because of Arab aggression, this war had become a nationalistic conflict over territory where the Jews were fighting for their survival.
People forget that this was war. Ein breira. We have no choice. Our backs are to the wall. The Arabs thought they'd retreat, they'd come back. It was a different story. The Jews were fighting for their lives.
The Arabs believed that the Arab countries would come to their assistance with the victorious Arab armies, or they believed that eventually some sort of repatriation of them would happen. But this is not what happened.
In early May 48, before the state was created, Haganah Radio repeatedly begged the Arabs to stay in Haifa. The appeal fell on deaf ears.
In direct response to the Zionists' appeal, the Arab League and the Grand Mufti forbade Arabs to remain in territories where they would have to submit to Jewish rule. The flight of Arabs from Palestine has been a deeply contentious issue for more than 60 years after the fact.
We are talking about a period when the idea of repatriation was not accepted neither by European states nor by India. There was the experience of the partition of India with great movements of people on both sides. In Europe, at the end of the Second World War, Germans were expelled from Eastern Prussia, where they were settled for hundreds of years. They were expelled from Poland. They were expelled from Czechoslovakia. About 12 million Germans had to be on the move. Now, the Jews believed that the Arabs are the attackers because they did not accept any compromise and they did not accept the partition proposal accepted by the UN. So there was a feeling that here we have a partition along the lines of ethnic division between the groups. So in the same way that Germans were not allowed back to the countries where they were expelled from, or the Pakistanis back to India, the Jews believed that this is a similar case, and that the Palestinian refugees would settle in the Arab countries bordering on Israel. This is not what happened.
For the ordinary local Arab living in Palestine, the situation was personally tragic. But let us not be naive here. The Palestinian Arab leadership and the leadership in the surrounding Arab countries knew exactly what was happening. This was an escalating war for the complete control of Palestine.
Abdullah of Transjordan, Farouk of Egypt, and Ibn Saud of Arabia unite the Arab world against the Jewish state. Abdullah alone commands an efficient fighting force, the Arab Legion, trained and equipped by Britain under the terms of her treaty with Transjordan.
On one hand, after the most terrible persecution in their history, where nearly 40% of the world's Jewish population had been murdered in Europe, the Jews were fighting for their right to return to their legally apportioned part of Palestine, as decided and approved by the United Nations. On the other hand, the Arab leadership, having rejected the United Nations partition plan, made their position quite clear. They were fighting for total control of Palestine, and they were determined to drive the Jews into the sea.
The borders of the new Jewish state were now emerging, not from UN resolutions, but from the bloody battles between Arabs and Jews. On April the 18th, 1948, the British evacuated Sfat and Tiberias in northern Palestine. Immediately, the Jews and the Arabs rushed to take possession of the former British strongholds. In a battle reminiscent of the Maccabee victory over the Greeks, the Palmach, the strike force of the Haganah, with only 1,400 soldiers under the command of Yigal Allon, defeated 10,000 Arab fighters to take control of Sfat in the Galilee. Here, too, many thousands of Arab residents fled to surrounding Arab countries. Britain indicated it would leave the country by August 1948, but as the fighting began to turn against the local Palestinian Arab forces, it moved the departure to May the 15th, convinced that neighboring Arab armies would invade and overwhelm the Jews. In the United States, old tensions emerged anew. President Truman began to support the creation of a Jewish state, but was bitterly opposed by Secretary of State George Marshall and Secretary of Defense James Forrestal. Initially, President Truman refused the entreaties of an aged and ailing Chaim Weizmann to meet with him. But at this point in time, divine providence revealed itself. Years earlier, President Truman had been in partnership in a haberdashery store in Kansas City, Missouri, with a man named Eddie Jacobson, who had remained his lifelong friend. Zionist leaders approached Jacobson to prevail upon Truman to talk with Weizmann.
The Zionists contact Jacobson and basically persuade him, you're the only man who can get to Truman now. This is the 12th hour. You've got to persuade him to receive Weizmann, and Weizmann will do the rest. Jacobson goes to Truman, and he gets nowhere. The minute he walks in, Truman says, Eddie, before we go further, I don't want to hear a word about Zionism. He's tongue-tied. What can he say? That was the whole mission. Goes around, skating around, gets nowhere. He's about to go when this very simple man, Eddie Jacobson, looking outside the White House window, Lafayette Square Park. There's a statue of Andrew Jackson there. It says, Harry, I know that Andy Jackson has always been your hero. Well, Chaim Weizmann has always been my hero. You've got to see him. And Truman's spluttering. He says, you son of a bitch, I'll see him, but don't tell anyone. Just straight out, expletives and all. And Jacobson goes out, reports to his people. The word gets to Weizmann, and he goes to see Truman. That meeting has never been written down, but Truman basically says to Weizmann, if you declare a Jewish state, I will back you.
Declaring a Jewish state was one thing. Defining the nature of that Jewish state was something entirely different. As usual throughout our history, we Jews have always argued, especially over the issue of Jewish identity, how we define ourselves.
The Declaration of Independence itself is a reflection of the tensions between the secular and religious camp. And that's always plagued Zionism. For example, does one mention God's name in the Declaration of Independence? Secularists and extreme ones such as Yitzhak Greunebaum of the Jewish Agency wanted to have no mention whatsoever. The religious insisted, how can you have a Jewish state in a declaration without the name of God mentioned? The compromise was Tzur Yisrael, the rock of Israel. For religious Jews, that clearly meant God. We say it in our prayers, Tzur Yisrael, before the Amidah of the Tefillah of every day. On the other hand, for secularists, that could mean anything. And that was purposely done, if you will, to paper up the differences between the religious and the secularists.
On the afternoon of May 14th, the British finally left Palestine after 30 years of mandatory rule.
Amidst the increasing violence and chaos of the collapsing Palestinian society around them, and in the face of the threat of Arab invasion from other countries, the Executive Committee of the Jewish Agency voted in favor of the establishment of a Jewish state. David Ben-Gurion declared independence immediately, naming the new state Israel.
אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגענו לזמן הזה.
The date of Friday, May 14th, 1948, on the eve of the Sabbath, was a turning point in Jewish history. For the first time in 2,000 years, the Jews regained sovereignty over their ancient homeland. 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion's declaration, President Truman was the first world leader on behalf of the United States of America to officially recognize the new state of Israel.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
It was announced by loudspeaker in the streets, and everybody who could move, who could walk, went, and together we were dancing in the streets and thanking Hashem that he helped the people of Israel to become again a nation. And for us survivors, for sure it meant a lot that we can be in our country and we won't be called again dirty Jew.
For the survivors of the Holocaust, waiting in the DP camps in Europe and the internment camps in Cyprus, this moment, which they had prayed and suffered for so long, was finally a reality. They, together with Jews world over, celebrated this historic moment. But their celebration soon turned to concern.
On the one hand, the declaration of Israel's independence could be viewed as an act of possible national suicide. The whole Arab world against Israel, and with borders that, according to military experts, could not easily be defended, especially at that time. The odds, according to logic, were therefore against Israel's survival. With no other country in the world willing to fight for us, or even with us, and after all, how many were there of us? With only a few fighter planes and a handful of armaments, the state looked like sheer insanity. On the other hand, it was an act of faith. Ein breira. We really had no choice. There was nowhere else to go. So despite all the disagreements, once the state was established, world Jewry held its breath and prayed for Israel's success and survival.
Within hours of Israel's declaration of independence, Syria attacked the infant state, followed the next day by 4 other Arab states. In an official cablegram from the Secretary-General of the League of Arab States to the UN Secretary-General on May 15, 1948, the Arab states publicly proclaimed their aim of creating a united state of Palestine, in place of the Jewish and Arab two-state UN plan. Egyptian bombers attacked Tel Aviv, and army units from Iraq, Syria, Transjordan, and Lebanon crossed the borders into Israel.
The whole world played the numbers game. How can 600,000 Jews defeat 30 million Arabs? Our State Department played that game and said, those Jews are going to be driven into the sea. And the whole world believed that, except those of us who had been there and had seen these new Jews. They would fight to the end.
For the survival of the State of Israel, the outcome of the war in the coming weeks and months was far from certain.
For the believing Jew, the remarkable resurgence of Jewish life after the Holocaust and having the land of Israel back in our hands after 2,000 years of exile were miracles, direct signs of the divine hand in Jewish history. The Lord had promised to return us to our homeland. But then, the war for Israel's survival was only just beginning. And unfortunately, it's a war that continues to this day. It's really a tragedy that the Arab leaders in 1948 found no place in their hearts to live and let live, and accept the United Nations partition plan, which was so favorable to them. Had they done so at that time, how different the story of the Middle East and the world might have been today.
Perhaps, during no other decade in the 20th century had the pendulum swung as widely for the Jewish people as it did from 1945 to 1948. For every Jew in the world, especially each and every survivor who lived through the Holocaust and saw the Jewish state miraculously emerge just 3 years later, with the War of Independence still raging, the story was far from over.